Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Gimblett. I'm the director of the Center for Global Peace Journalism here at Park University, and I am also the co-sponsor of the Greater Kansas City Peace Building Conference. So in just a moment, I'm going to introduce our moderator for today. Before we do, I'd like to acknowledge two special guests in the audience, the co-planners and originators of the Kansas City Peace Building Conference from Johnson County Community College, Jeanette Jasperson, and Dr. Tom Patterson. Welcome, and thank you not just for launching the Peace Building Conference, but for allowing me to take part in this outstanding event. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to journalist, to educator, Louis Duguid, who will do a more thorough job of introducing himself and our featured speaker. Mr. Duguid.
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second session of the 2021 Greater Kansas City Peace Building Conference. This year, we are hosting a couple of months of peace focused on the theme, Healing Our Polarized Societies. This conference is co-sponsored by Johnson County Community College and the Center for Global Peace Journalism at Park University. My name, as Steve mentioned, is Louis Duguid. I was a longtime journalist with the Kansas City Star, and now I'm an author, lecturer, freelance writer, and political action committee chair for the National Association for Multicultural Education. Today, I'm your moderator. First, some housekeeping. We are recording this session, so if you have concerns about that, please take the appropriate steps now, such as turning off your video. For those individuals who are joining us via Zoom, please be sure to mute yourself for the benefit of the speaker and the rest of the audience. For those joining us virtually, if you have any questions for our presenter, please put them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. I will share your questions with our presenter, who will leave time at the end of her program to provide answers. For those who are present at Park University, please raise your hand with your question and we will get the presenter to respond. Our 2021 Greater Kansas City Peace Building Conference began September 16 with Michael Collins, Executive Director for the Americas at Institute for Economics and Peace. His virtual presentation was titled Positive Peace, Empowering the Peace Builder We Each Have Within. You can find it online by searching for Johnson County Community College and Peace Building. Today we will hear from Murray Rose Williams, my good friend and former colleague at the Kansas City Star. Murray Rose Williams this year joined the Kansas City Star's editorial board after 22 years as the Star's award-winning education reporter. In 2020, Ms. Williams conceived and led the Star's project, Truth in Black and White, an apology for its more than 100 years of neglect in covering Kansas City's Black community and the paper's perpetuation of racism in the city. The piece was awarded the Society of Professional Journalists Special Citation for Excellence in Journalism, and Ms. Williams won the 2021 Eleanor McClatchy Award for contributing to the company's transformation in the way it does journalism. Murray Rose Williams had been a news reporter for the Star beginning in 1998. In 2008, she was awarded the Alfred Friendly Fellowship and traveled to Kenya, where she taught free press and writing to young journalists. In 2015, Ms. Williams covered the student protest at the University of Missouri, Columbia, and with a colleague, uncovered fake college rankings at the University of Missouri, Kansas City Block School of Management, for which she received the prestigious Gerald Loeb Award. After coming to the Star, Ms. Williams, before coming to the Star, Ms. Williams also worked with the Atlanta Constitution, and Newsday on Long Island, New York. She came to the Star with her husband, the late Caesar M. Williams, who worked at the Star as an editor for several years. Ms. Williams has two sons, and the oldest, Caesar Williams III, is the Star's first editor for race and equity. Her youngest son works as an engineer for a Kansas City firm. Ray Rose Williams will speak with us today on the media as a tool for healing polarized societies. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Williams.
Wow, Louis, that was, I mean, I've never heard all that stuff about myself before. It's interesting to hear all of those things. Thank you very much for having me here today. It's really my pleasure to be here with you, especially since, as I found out today, 10 years ago, I met Professor Youngblood when I was an education writer to do a story about the Global Peace Center. And, you know, at the time that I talked to him, there was something in me, I always wanted to be a part of that. I always wanted to be known as a journalist who perpetuated peace. And I thought if I could accomplish that, if that could be part of my repertoire, then I will have achieved, you know, what it is I got into this business to do in the first place. And so here I am today, so I have to say I'm very happy to be here and to be considered a peace journalist. So thank you for that. So I did not write anything, and the reason I didn't write anything down is because I wanted to talk to you where I am truest, and that is from my heart. Because that's how this project, The Truth in Black and White, came to be. It came from my heart, from my gut, and often I do believe that the best journalism comes just from that place, from your heart and your gut. And if you are a journalist and you forget your heart and you forget your gut, then you are lost. You're going in the wrong direction. And I think that that's why I wanted to come here and talk to you today about this project, which was dear to my heart, and just explain to you how it was conceived, why it was conceived, and how we were able to pull it off. To start, let me go back to when I started as a journalist. This was in the early 80s. I was in West Virginia. I'm originally from New York. I was 20 years old, so that tells you something. A young Black woman in West Virginia, in Appalachia, working right out of college was a very challenging time for me. And I wanted to, right off the top, I wanted to spend a lot of time in the communities, getting to know the African American community in West Virginia where I was. But when I would go into those communities, one of the things I heard often from people was that they did not trust me. They did not trust mainstream media. They didn't trust mainstream media because they never saw themselves in the newspaper. They never saw themselves in mainstream newspaper. So they couldn't identify it. They didn't feel like they cared about them, how they lived. And so as a result, they didn't read it. That stuck with me, right? Fast forward to 2020. Here we are at a time when supposedly a reckoning on race is happening in America. And this is right after George Floyd was killed that summer. There are protests going on all over the country where folks are protesting against police brutality and the unjust killing of unarmed, for the most part, Black men. And this is happening repeatedly. Protest after protest after protest. So we're reading about these protests, and what we're hearing about these protests are that the people are violent, the protesters are violent, that they are destructive, that they are antagonizing towards police. And so in that discussion is lost the cause. Why are they out there in the first place? Begins to be lost in this discussion about violence from protesters. At that time, the Kansas City Star, like newspapers around the country, had lost most of its staff because of the internet and the changes in the industry. So our staff had dwindled to almost nothing. And well, we knew we had to cover these protests, and they were happening day after day. So what happened was they asked other reporters, beat reporters like myself, at the time I was an education writer, to join in and help on a rotation to cover these protests. So comes time for me to cover protests. The night before, I spent that time reading, watching everything on the news about the protests, reading everything the Star had written about the protests. And again, what I saw there was that protesters were violent, they were destructive, burning cars, antagonizing police, and police had to deploy chemical repellent on these protesters to keep them at bay, to control them. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, I gotta go out there and cover this. Oh, it's gonna be awful. That's my thinking, right? That next day I get up there, and when I get up there, I didn't see any of that. What I saw were hundreds of people. They were angry, yes, they're protesters. They were holding up signs. They were shouting at the police because they were angry, but that's what protesters do, right? When they're trying to be heard, they're trying to make their voices heard. The police, on the other hand, were 3 deep around the protest area in full riot gear, and they were very antagonizing, right? They were the antagonizers, and not only that, they would often, sometimes they would pull somebody off the sidewalk, and then, of course, we have to spray them with repellent, and then we have to arrest them. They were even spewing repellent over the entire crowd, chemical repellent over the entire crowd. I got sprayed. And these people were not violent. There was no violence at all. I began to look at this, at what I was seeing from the perspective of the protester. And that is where the peace comes in, right? When you start to look at the situation from the perspective of the people who are being oppressed and what is their situation, and trying to see what they're seeing, and that's what I was starting to do. I identified with them. So I left that protest that evening. I had to run from the repellent. It was all over me. I got home, I was angry. I was angry to the point of tears. I was just like, this is horrible. I reported in that what I had seen, that it was not the protesters, but the police, and we need to write about that. We need to write that it's the police who are antagonizing these protesters and they're wrong, and we need to write about that, which we did. And then that later became the story, if you recall, that became the story across the country, that's what was happening. After I washed all this repellent off my face and hands, I started to sit there and try to think what I had actually seen out there. And what I saw was Kansas City had come together in one place from all walks of life, all age groups, all hues. And I said, you know what? Kansas City just might be ready to tussle with racism. That's what I saw. They might be ready to tussle with racism. Remember that story I just told you about when I first started in journalism? About people saying that they didn't trust the mainstream press? I started thinking at that moment, how can I, as a journalist, use my skills as a journalist? Because I want to be part, if Kansas City is ready to tussle with race, I want to be part of that. That's something I want to be a part of. But how can I use my journalism to be a part of that? I thought about what those people had told me all those many years ago about not trusting mainstream media, and I started thinking, why is that? So I did some cursory research, and I found that indeed the Kansas City Star, like every other newspaper in America, had failed to cover their Black communities. They have either covered it inadequately, inaccurately, or ignored it completely. And I said, this is what we need to do. We need to apologize to them, because that perpetuated racism in this city. It didn't do harm just to the Black folks in the community. It did harm to all of Kansas City, because if we describe African Americans in a false light, those who don't live with them, which they did, which white people that for many, many years did not live next door to black folks. They didn't go to school with black folks. They didn't work with black folks. The only thing they knew about black folks was what they read in our newspaper. And if we weren't telling them the truth, then their perception of who these people are was skewed. And so we had to apologize for that, because by doing that, what we were doing is perpetuating racism in the city, in all aspects of the city, in our education, in our housing, in our businesses, in every way. We did not tell the truth. And so I wrote a proposal that we should do this, and I brought it to my editors. Let me just add this. I think before I wrote the proposal, actually, I did talk to Mr. Duguid about it. I went to some other folks that I knew, mentors of mine, and talked to them about, what do you think of this idea? And some of them, I think I even got a chuckle out of Mr. Duguid, but some of them chuckled that, they didn't know that the Star would be ready to do this. But I made this proposal. Part of the proposal was, it's not gonna be enough for us to just write an apology, a front page apology. That's been done already. There have been newspapers that have written a front page apology about one issue that they had, where they had perpetuated racism in one way, but it was not gonna be enough for us to write just a one-page proposal. I wanted the Star not only to write the proposal, not only to admit to its perpetuation of racism, but I wanted the Star to also put a team of reporters together to go back and research stories and issues and instances that happened in Kansas City, and research them and rewrite those stories the way they should have been written in the first place. So I wanted it to be an all-out effort, because this is Missouri, for goodness sake. It's not enough for people to hear that you perpetuated racism. I wanted us to show them. I wanted it to be laid out so that nobody could dispute what had happened. And so when I brought the proposal to them, because I had done this research and I could show them where we had actually done these things, they said, okay, let's try it. And so we presented it to the full staff, and people were chomping at the bit to try to be part of this project. We picked three other writers, all really top-notch writers. I don't know if anyone has read any of their stuff. Eric Adler, Mike Hendricks, who had been a columnist for a very long time, and Cortland Stark, a young, very talented reporter. And with the three of them and myself, we started figuring out how we would go about doing this project. The intent for me was that it would do what I do believe it has done, and that is to transform, change the way the Kansas City Star attacks journalism, deals with its marginalized communities, writes about its marginalized communities going forward. I had no idea, however, that it would end up being a project that would go global. I mean, we ended up hearing from, the national newspaper in Japan about this project, and they wrote about it and they put us on the front page. We ended up hearing from New Zealand, and they put it on the front page because they too wanted to take up a similar project, a similar look at themselves. So look internal at how we had done journalism for 100 and some odd years. One of the first things that we did was to pull together a group of community folks, Black folks in the community, and talk to them about the project, about what we wanted to do and how we wanted to do this, and to ask them their thoughts. And right off the bat, they said exactly what I've heard my whole life as a journalist from minority communities. So, the minority community does not trust you, and there is no way that you are going to mend that, because it's been so many years of distrust. But that was the goal. So it was this enormous goal that we had to try to bridge that gap between the mainstream newspaper and these marginalized communities, not just the Black community, although we dealt with the Black community because it's the largest minority community in the metro. That's why we dealt with the Black community. And there was clear evidence of us perpetuating racism in that way. But certainly, the same way that we attacked or didn't attack or failed to attack issues that impacted the Black communities, the same way we failed to deal with every marginalized community in Kansas City. So after we met with a group of community folks, we began to chip away at how we were going to do this. Thank God for the Black press. Seriously, because consider that we were trying to write about something we hadn't written about before. So we were trying to go after stories that we hadn't written about. So where were we going to find them? There was no archive in the Kansas City Star. There was nothing archived in the Kansas City Star for us to use. So where were we going to find about these issues that happened in 1920 and 1940 and the truth in those stories? The only way we would be able to do that is if some other newspaper or had written about it, and Black press. The Black press had all of these beautiful stories, and so we were able to compare what the Black press had written with what the mainstream media had written, which was little to nothing, or oftentimes when they did write about African Americans, as you'll see when you read this the project, they it was like caricatures. And I think I wanted to show Steve, you can, please come, thank you, what our front page ended up looking like. So this was how we presented it, and what people got was this front page, which included the apology from the Star, which was written by Mike Bannon, who is the president and publisher of the Star, and he wrote this apology. I will say that people wondered how we were able to get somebody like the president and publisher to buy into doing something like this, admitting that your paper had been racist for 100 years. And one of the things that I think really did it was I could present to them and say, listen, we are striving to get more and more readers. We are not going to get our Black community to read our newspaper unless we can convince them that they can trust us. Unless we can convince them that we are going to cover their community fairly, adequately. And in order to do that, the first thing you have to do is to admit you're wrong. You're wrong, where you failed, and to apologize for that. And I convinced them that if we could do that, we should try. And if we could do that, that we will gain a tremendous amount of readership. And readership, of course, is dollars, right? So basically, I was sort of going after the pocket. That always works. And so that was one way that we were able to convince, not just Mike, but also our owner, McClatchy at the time, that this was a good thing to do. And of course, they could see, given the state of the nation, with, as I said, that reckoning on race that we were in the midst of, that this was a good thing to do. And so he wrote this apology, and it was very powerful. And then we had 6 other stories that we dealt with. We dealt with culture. We dealt with, this is interesting here, for people are mind boggled by this, that Charlie Parker, who is a native son, and who Kansas City boasts as a native son, when he was here and young and performing and rising to fame, the Kansas City Star failed to even write about him. They didn't even acknowledge this man, and many others. There was a time, for example, when Martin Luther King came to Kansas City, and there was a huge gathering around him, and we didn't write about it. Kansas City Star did not write about it. Things like that we just ignored. So we dealt with culture. We also dealt with, the civil rights movement and how we portrayed civil rights movement, in the Kansas City Star. And we, lunch counters, we just failed completely in covering that story. There was a moment when there was a mass shooting. I would call it a mass shooting, but it wasn't. I mean, there were like 6 people killed during riots. They called them riots, but protests in Kansas City Central at the high school, and 6 people were killed. All of them were Black. And we did write about that, right? But it was the terminology that we used, right? It was a riot instead of a protest. The police shootings were described using the police reports. We did no work in finding out who these people actually were. And so as the police described every single one of them, they would add little things like, for example, one of them was a 16-year-old child. They couldn't find anything negative to say about the 16-year-old child, so they said, oh yeah, his grades weren't very good. And we put that in the paper, like, why? I mean, one of them had divorce. We couldn't find anything negative to say about him, so we said, oh, by the way, he's been married a couple of times. As if to diminish who these people really were. I mean, this was a child, a student who was shot, and the other person was his dad. But we didn't talk about their lives and the good that they did. Instead, we allowed ourselves to color them as almost as if to say they deserve that, those kinds of things. So a lot of what we also found when we started doing this research and how we covered the Black community also dealt with very minor tone, not just what we said or what we didn't say, but tone was huge. So that was one of the things that we dealt with, was civil rights. We also dealt with, this is part of the way we describe African Americans, for the most part, when African Americans in our paper for decades. The only time they made the paper was when they were involved or were the subject or the victims of crime. So we're painting them as criminals, and we're painting them as caricatures. I mean, so what do you expect? What do you expect when someone who has had no connection with an African American, their perception of who they are? They're criminals, they're lazy, we painted them as they're living in rundown communities, as opposed to giving a holistic view of who our neighbors, our fellow citizens really are. We did not do that. We also dealt with education as well. We dealt with this story was J.C. Nichols. J.C. Nichols was notorious for redlining in Kansas City. I don't know what redlining is, but that was basically segregating communities and preventing African Americans from living in certain parts of the city, right? And reserving and they did that by working with real estate agents and advertisers to keep African Americans from moving into certain communities and keeping the city segregated. And that notion, the way they figured that out, that notion of redlining, they started with Nichols, but it went all over the country, and that was happening in every city in America, where they began to do that redlining and keeping African Americans from moving to certain parts of town. And we would sell homes to them, or blockbusting, which was also part of that, where they would, like if they wanted to segregate an area, they would go in and sell one house to an African American and then tell everybody else in that community or in that small area that, oh, like the Black people are here, they're gonna bring your property values down, and you really need to sell your house and get out before it explodes with African Americans who are going to destroy your property values. And when they would do that, people would move and they would sell their house, they would buy the house cheap, then sell high to the next person, another African American, to perpetuate this problem, and that's what they called blockbuster. And that happened in Kansas City, and I'm not gonna say that it absolutely originated in Kansas City, but it largely it did. And J.C. Nichols Fountain, remember, he was responsible for that. So we wrote about that happening because prior to us writing about it here, you would have seen no mention of it in the Kansas City Star. I mean, and that's huge. As I was saying before, we also wrote about education. Now, Kansas City has had a huge desegregation case in Kansas City when they wanted to desegregate the schools. And we wrote about it from the perspective of the school board, which is what we did often. We wrote about issues from the perspective of the authorities. We never went into the community to talk to the people who were impacted. And that's another thing about empathy and writing with empathy, is you can't write with empathy for the people you're writing about unless you talk to the people you're writing about. And for many, many years, newspapers, the Kansas City Star included, failed to talk with the people that they were reporting on. And that we would write from reports and meetings and from authorities, from their perspective, and fail to talk to the people who were impacted. So we never got their story. And this was huge with marginalized communities. This was huge with Black communities, because remember, we already painted Black communities as run down, full of criminals, and just dirty and unkept. That's how we had already painted them. So that also instilled fear into young reporters who came into our offices, who failed to go into these communities to talk to these people, to tell their story. And so we get stories about, in this case, boundary changes that were happening in the school district. But we never go and talk to the people to find out what impact those boundary changes were having and what they really meant. So what we failed to find by not doing that, we didn't find that what the district was actually doing was keeping the schools segregated by changing boundaries. When people would move into certain areas, they would just move the boundaries a little bit so that they could keep Black kids in one school and white kids in another school, which was in violation of federal law. So they were violating federal law by continuing to keep schools segregated. And the Kansas City Star, the #1 newspaper in the metro area, it was happening right in front of their faces, and they never wrote about it because they didn't see it, because they never talked to the people in the community. They just wrote about what the school board would tell them was happening. Oh, we just did a boundary change today. That's no big deal. They did like 12 boundary changes in like a week or something. I mean, they were doing massive boundary changes. And so we wrote about that. One of the challenging things about this whole project for us as journalists was that there were stories that we found that were so compelling, we wanted to write about the story itself. We had to keep in mind that what we were actually doing was writing about the Star's failure to write the story. And that's a different thing altogether. So many times, even when I was writing this piece, I got caught up in writing about all the stuff that was happening at the time, and it was getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and then I had to check myself and say, oh no, okay, what we're writing about is where the Star failed, not rewriting the story, so to speak, even though that was what I really wanted to do, because it hadn't been told. So I had to figure out a way to tell the story that hadn't been told, as well as tell how the Star failed to do it. And that was challenging. So yeah, this was one of the big stories that we covered in the series. Another thing we wrote about, and Professor Youngblood said that he found this the most interesting, was we wrote about the 1977 flood in Kansas City. It was a huge flood in Kansas City. It was when Rush Creek flooded, and people were killed. When the Star wrote about the 1977 flood, they called it the Plaza Flood. And one of the editors that I interviewed, he had been an editor at the Star at the time that this flood happened. In fact, he was the Metro editor at the Star when this happened. And he lived in Johnson County, and on his way to work that day, of course, the flood had happened, so there was all kinds of detours. And when he gets into the office, the first thing he said, he came up, he said, okay, so what are we gonna say about this Plaza Flood? that was, so instantly, the only thing that they cared about was the plaza. Well, this water had flowed through Rush Creek east, and yes, it flooded the plaza, but it went east into the Black community. It went down past, the Atkins Museum and into the Black community and completely flooded out the Black community. And the Star just ignored that. We wrote about how windows were broken and on the Country Club Plaza and how, all of the retail clothing and food was lost because of the high waters. Meanwhile, there were lives lost, Black lives lost. There were Black homes that were devastated, and we failed to write about that. Which I have to say, there were many times working on this project when I literally sat at my desk and cried. And I cried because this is a profession that I love. And while I knew that these kinds of things had happened, as I discovered the magnitude at which we had failed to cover the Black community, it just made me sad. It made me so sad that I literally, like, many times I just cried, hearing the stories about what actually happened to some of these people and how we as a newspaper had just completely ignored them and failed to write about them in any way. I was able to, what was beautiful was I was able to find this gentleman who was a descendant of someone who was killed in the flood. And the way I was able to find him was through the Black press. So I went and I read the stuff, the call, and I went and spent many hours at the Missouri Valley Room at the Kansas City Public Library, which is their archives area, and the call is all on microfiche. And I'm just gonna take a little jump here. Hey, if anybody, a great project for some college group to do would be to figure out a way to convince the call to digitize their all of their history, all of their papers, because it's not digitized. And it was very hard at first I would love to have been able to sit at my desk and just, go back into newspaper archives like I could with the Star and look at, but the call is not digitized. And the only way you could find that stuff was to go and spend hours in the Missouri Valley and going through my, just saying, that might be a great college project. So anyway, so I was able to go and look up what the call had done with the flood. And in doing that, what the call did was every time they put somebody's name in the paper, they also put their address and other pieces of information about them. So then I could use reverse search and search using the address and finding their name, and I could use True People search to find anybody connected to their name. I used obituaries to find out who was still alive, and I was able to basically trace to family members and find descendants of some of the people who were killed in the flood. And this was one gentleman that I was able to find. And I interviewed him about what it was like. He was around at the time, so he could tell me, what it was like to living in that community when the floodwaters came, and also what happened afterwards. And I was talking earlier about the fact that because of the way we covered the flood, because of the way we didn't cover the Black community during the flood, when those people went to get federal dollars and federal help, and this is this is how it perpetuates racism. This is a prime example. Okay, so we didn't cover the Black community during the flood. Then, when the federal government came in to help people, who had suffered from the flood, the Black folks who we had never wrote about, and we weren't telling folks how bad it was in their community, they had a hard time with the federal government getting dollars to get help. Because if we had written about how awful it was for them, that would have been documented. They could see that these communities had suffered greatly, and it would have been easier for them to get help from the federal government. But it was really hard, so hard that Congressman Cleaver ended up going to DC to testify on behalf of the Black community in order to get money so that these people could get help after their homes and lives had been devastated by a flood that we call the Placid Flood. And so, that's, that was the kind of thing that made me weep when I was working on this project. So we do this whole project, and so one of the questions we got afterwards was, okay, so is this gonna be a one-off? You do this project and then nothing comes of it, what happens after that? Well, here's where the transformation came in. My hope was that after doing this, that we would take responsibility for how we cover these communities going forward. That it would become part of our DNA in covering Black communities so that we never do this again. That we get out in the communities and we talk to people, that we connect and we find out what's going on in their communities and we write about it. So one of the things that we did, one of the first things that we did was to form an advisory committee that would keep us on track with that. And they have been doing that. Our editors meet with them once a month. They talk about what's going on in the various communities in a very diverse advisory committee so that we know, because we can't be everywhere. That's another issue that we have. I mean, our staffs are far, we used to have like 300, I was also at 300 folks working at the Star, and now we're down to 57, so. Yeah, huge, so we can't be everywhere. We do depend in a great way on the communities to help us. And this advisory committee does that. In addition to that, the Kansas City Star, as Mr. Judy said earlier, hired its very first race and equities editor at the Star to make sure that those issues are covered and that he has a staff like Black reporters that definitely is out covering those issues, things that we never wrote about before and we are doing now. It has made a difference. I get so much better reception from people. They trust that when they give me information about a story, that I truly want to write about their community and their lives. And I hear that from other reporters who also are getting reception. Besides that, we as reporters are looking for those stories. When I don't know that the general staff at the Star was actually looking for these kinds of stories before. There were a few of us who were, but not all. And we're actually looking for those stories. I will say this, that here's where diversity matters. That if I were not at the Star, as a Black woman at the Star, I would have gone to that protest and I would not have seen it the way I saw it. And had I not seen it the way I saw it and gotten angry and gone back to my editors, it may not, this project may never have happened. My point being is that's what diversity is about, is being able to have someone who can see things differently from the way you see it, right? Because we don't all see things the same way. And so, I mean, because there have been reporters out there before me, but I was actually the first Black reporter from the Star to actually be out there covering the protest at the time. And so, because I saw things differently, because I was empathetic, because I saw what was happening through the eyes of the people it was happening to, we were able to do a project that I think was, it was enormous in that it definitely transformed the way we do journalism at the Star and elsewhere as well. But we have a long way to go. There's a lot of work to be done. We won't get there until it really is in our breath. In other words, that it is not something we are consciously having to talk about, but that we are covering our communities, our marginalized communities, just as diligently as we have covered for the most part, the middle class white in America. And when we are covering them all equally with the same heart and the same soul and the same empathy, then and only then will we have arrived where I hope we get to because of the work we put in here to do this project. I'm not sure I have much else to say about that unless there are questions. I don't know.
Thank you. Well, at this point, we'll turn it over to Louis and we'll have a brief conversation. And then we'll turn it over to the audience and the folks on line for their questions.
Great, all right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Since you're going to be answering questions, I think this will be a side-by-side.
Oh,
No rest, Marie.
And feel free to grab a water. You're probably,
I'm good.
okay.
I think that because this is a peace building conference, I want to ask Marie to talk about how the STARS project really blends in with building peace. So if you could tackle that.
I think, as I said, when I was talking earlier about this idea of how we described and portrayed a marginalized community, falsely portrayed a marginalized community, certainly was very polarizing, right? We divided a community. But this project, by doing this, the idea was to bridge a gap that had existed for hundreds of years and to begin to start to mend together some understanding and empathy with our fellow citizens. And the fact that just that as we did this, other newspapers across the country have also called us to ask us how they too can do what we have done. And if you think about that as a peace building mechanism, in that we're bringing communities together, recognizing our wrongs and trying to heal and mend, that it builds peace amongst our communities instead of us living in these various silos. And it's not just happening in Kansas City, but it's also happening in other communities and with other newspapers. If the newspaper can polarize, it can also unite. That's my thing.
Good response. I guess another thing that stands out to me about this project is how has it been received? I mean, it was published in December of 2020. 2020 was also the worst year for homicides in Kansas City. And we're starting to see a slowing of that murder rate. I guess I wonder from your perspective if you think that there's a connection.
I definitely think that there is a connection in that the Star has been writing a great deal about gun violence in Kansas City and what is happening and how we can tackle it. And certainly gun violence spreads is not just something that's in our marginalized community, but it goes across that bridge and it impacts everybody. So yes, the project has been a catalyst, although the Star was interested in writing about the gun violence in Kansas City even before the project and had started writing about gun violence in Kansas City before the project. But I think that the project has definitely added fuel to the effort to try to find some remedy to gun violence that's plaguing our community. So in that sense, the project has been very important to try to get to that end, to finding some solutions and holding both police and our other citizens accountable for the violence that's happening.
I'd like you to talk about next steps because the apology and pointing out the STARS error was great. But I think that from the Black community's perspective, people want to know what is coming next. What is the STAR going to do to correct the errors in judgment, the errors in racism, so that going forward, the newspaper is doing a better job in covering the community. I know you mentioned that there's a race and equity editor, your son, so you can hold him accountable. But beyond that, what's next?
Well, actually, the idea that race and equity editor, that's a good sounding board for the community, right? The community needs to know, for one thing, the community needs to know, is there somebody I can go to? Is there somebody at the Star that I can go to when I have a complaint? And we have that now for them. So that is one thing that we're doing. I will say also that in terms of internally, the Star has, said 28%, almost 30% of its staff now, are people of color. So that is a huge change, and so when you talk about the diversity, bringing that diversity into the Star, I used to do, when I would talk to high school journalism students, I would always tell them that good stuff in, good stuff out, and that holds true here, that the Star has hired a number of minority journalists, Black, Asian, Hispanic, and that is going to help to bring the community into the Star. Doing more outreach, us getting out into the community is gonna help to, I think, bridge the gap. So we're doing a lot more of that. We're doing a lot more coverage in minority communities in Kansas City, more than we've ever done before. And so I think that is a good thing. And also trying to establish a relationship. I'm not sure where this is going, because it's over my head in terms of my pay grade, but I do know that there was an effort made to build a relationship with the Black press in Kansas City. And that I think is an ongoing effort. So that's gonna help. We also, on the day that this project published, there were no Black obits in our paper. That had been a problem for many years, is that the Star did not have the obituaries for Black people in their paper. And there was some financial reasons for that, but other reasons as well. And one of the first things that we did was to begin to include Black obits free in our paper in an attempt to make up for what we had failed to do for so many years. Also profiling major Black community members and others, Native American, Indigenous people, profiling them in the paper, profiling Hispanic members of the community. So those are kind of some of the things that we're doing going forward. These things will continue.
Old guys can provide a little bit of background, just for your sake and providing context. The American Society of Newspaper Editors in 1978 said that it wanted newsrooms in the country to look like the overall population. So it wanted the percentage of journalists of color to equal the percentage of people in the population. That was in 1978. The goal was to have it occur by the year 2000, so that there would be this parity. In 1978, there were fewer than 4% journalists of color in newsrooms throughout the country. And they wanted it to equal the population. Well, by 1980, there were about 25% people of color in the population. So it looked like a doable goal. I used to tell people, when I started at the Star in '77, you could count the number of Black journalists who worked for then the Times and the Star on two hands and still have enough fingers to smoke a cigarette and drink a beer. So by 1999, what the industry realized is that they were not going to make the goal to be at parity with the population by the year 2000. Why? Because the percentage of people of color in the population increased to over 33%. And the news industry at the time was only at 11% journalists of color in newsrooms. So we were woefully behind. What did an industry that's based on deadlines do? They moved the deadline back to 2025. So now it's 2025 that they want to be at parity with the population. The Star, being at 28%, you said, is close because this area is a little bit more than 33% people of color for the entire metro, and that's about 2 million people, I think, 2-3 million. So it's better at the start than it's been forever. But we're still not there. I want to encourage people who are in the audience virtually to please put your questions in chat for folks who are in the audience here at Park University. Please, if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll get that answered. Yes, Jenna.
So, what about you said that previously the Star had primarily written to sort of a white, middle-class suburban audience. What was the feedback and the response from that audience to this project?
The feedback that we got was tremendous. Most people were, they had no idea that we were failing in that way. And a lot of what we got was very positive. In fact, we were invited to speak at a number of civic groups to talk about the project and how we did the project. People were very interested. Most of the feedback was very positive. There was very little negative feedback on this project, and I was happy to see that. Yeah.
Can I follow up with the question we were talking about earlier?
Yes.
Did this bring, and if you would repeat the question so that everyone can hear it, did this bring more of the haters out of the woodwork? Did you get that sort of racist feedback too?
Did we get racist feedback? Did it bring the haters out of the woodwork? And the answer to that is, well, by the time this project published, the haters were already out of the woodwork, I'll just say that. And we've been dealing with them for a very long time. But as far as the project was concerned, no. We did not get a tremendous amount of negative comments from haters, and I believe that the reason we didn't get that is because of the way we presented the project. That we didn't just make an apology and say we had done this horrible thing, but we also showed our readers what those things look like and what actually happened. They could see it, and once you can see that this is what happened, there's very little for you to yell at us about, right? It was right there in front of them, and that was the goal, it's one thing to hear that your mainstream newspaper had been racist in its coverage. It's a whole other thing to see it in front of your face, and then you can't dispute it, and that was the point.
Things that we've seen with the coronavirus and the mask versus no mask with the anti-vaxxers, that a lot of their sentiment is based on misinformation. And when you do as Murray and the STAR staff did in presenting a bountiful amount of information that clarifies what's going on, that with that information, people can, in their own judgment, make correct decisions. It's when they see that the newspaper is going against their preconceived notions or their prejudices, and there's no information that gives them more information to be able to walk away from their prejudices, that we have a problem. Again, any questions here in the audience? Yes, sir.
So I have a question about your colleagues. So were your colleagues equally supportive of you when you all were doing this project, or did you have that odd colleague who was less supportive and had some snide remark about this project?
No, there was nobody who was not supportive. In fact, one of the things that we also did, because we recognized that it was very important for our colleagues to support us. Just like it was important for members of the community to understand, especially the movers and shakers in the community, to understand what it was we were trying to do. So one of the things that we did was have an entire staff meeting to talk about this project and to allow them to have input into what we were doing. And if they knew of stories or ideas or things that they thought would contribute to the project. So everybody, I mean, all of our reporters, editors, photographers, and videographers were all engaged with what we had to do, because we counted on all of them in order to pull this off. Because if I'm not writing about education, somebody else has to, right? So while I'm working on the project, I had to have somebody who had my back. So everybody had to buy in to this project in order for it to work, and they did.
I want to add something to that. And I've not shared this with Ray, but after the apology ran in the newspaper, another old guy thing is we go to the doctor more. So I was at the doctor's office and another black man came in and he's recognized me even though I had the mask on. Another reason not to do anything wrong while out in public. Because my picture would run in the newspaper in the 30 years that I wrote a column. And he said, what do you think about that project that the Star has done apologize? I said, well, it's great and it's long overdue. And he said, you've been trying to tell us these things for 30 years. And that to me was an affirmation of all of the work that I've tried to do in journalism, in addition to complimenting the Star for everything that it's done. Other questions, please?
Students, I will call on you, Eileen.
Oh,
Tom will get to you.
So we thought the issue was released in December 2020. It's almost been a whole year since. Have you been able to see that the Black community has been more trusting towards the community side?
I think that, yes, but I also think that there's a long way to go. I mean, 100 years or something, that you're not gonna cure that or heal that in a year's time with one project. No matter how honest you and sincere you are with the effort. So yes, there has been some, but it will take time. Some of the things that I mentioned earlier, like the profiles that we've been doing, those help as well. The more we do those kinds of things, the more people start to call us and say, and this is how we know when the bridge is being built, right? When we start to hear from the Black community, when they call us and say, hey, this thing is going on, or that thing is going on, or this person has passed away, or write about this, when they start trusting their stories with us, right? Before we didn't get much of that. I think Lewis probably got more of that than anybody else at the Star, because he wrote about these issues in his column for years, but the rest of us weren't getting that, and we're getting a lot more of that. We also have a newsletter that goes out on Thursdays that is targeted towards marginalized communities, Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, LGBTQ. And that is written in a tone and in a language and in a way that it is obvious that is the audience that it is geared towards. So, and that has helped as well.
I have a follow-up question.
Yes.
So do you ever believe that there will be complete trust within the Black community and media, or do you think that is something that?
I don't think that there's complete trust with any community and the media. I mean, I think we have, what's happened as of 2016, a lot of the trust that we did have with the communities, our communities that we cover, has been, there was a chiseling away of that trust with our previous administration. And I think that we're still trying to amend that. One of the things that we did try to do was, we were having small group meetings in various parts of Kansas City metro area with small community groups, just to talk about what it was they wanted to see in the newspaper. And we started that long before we started the project, and this is in all community groups. And that was because we could see that the trust between the media and the book and our readers, that it was being chiseled away with, expressions like fake news and things like that. I hate to say that word. I can't believe it came out of my mouth, because it doesn't, there's no such thing, really, it doesn't make any sense. But, so, yes and no, if you will. I mean, I don't know, it's not something that's gonna happen very quickly. It'll be years in the making, but it can get better, and that's the idea, it can be improved a great deal.
Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation and for taking that question to the editorial board. It's really important. My question is on the intersection between history and journalism. And in view of, revisionist history, like Jill Lepore recently published the history of these truths, which was in her attempt to be more inclusive in terms of populations that had been excluded. So what responsibility does journalism have in terms of bringing these new ways of looking at history to the general population?
I think it's critical, right? Because if you, let's just say we didn't do this project at all, right? We didn't make this admission at all. And, 50 years from now, what have you, 20, 50, 60, 100 years from now, someone goes back to look at what Black Kansas City looked like. And they went to the Kansas City Star to do some research on the history of Black Kansas City. What they would find in the Star, it would be just nothing, it would exclude that, so it's vital. I mean, newspapers for so many years, as you know, Tom, for so many years, they were newspapers of record and they were responsible for accounting for everything that happened in a particular community. And so, yes, I think newspapers play a vital role in history, and how we are portraying a people. Unfortunately, currently, with everything being online and so much is lost, and how we have this 24/7 news hole, I wonder about what that will look like in 100 years from now. I'm not really sure. I mean, we are no longer a paper of record. And so there is so much that is lost, and I'm not sure what that's gonna look like, but I am happy to have been a part of at least if someone were to go back and try to read what Black Kansas City looked like, they would know because of this project that everything you're reading is tainted in some way, and that you need to also do research elsewhere to get a true picture of what Kansas City Black community was like. I know that there was a book written, I'm trying to remember the name of the book, but, and I think his name was Gorman, help me, Lewis, you know the book I'm talking about, where he looks at Kansas City, the history of Kansas City.
Race, equity, and uneven.
Yes, and in his book, when he was writing this book and researching Kansas City, Black Kansas City, he actually says in the book that he went to the Kansas City Star to see what Black Kansas City was like, and he found nothing, and he had to go to the Black Press. He actually writes that into the book, that there was, the Kansas City Star was of no help to him in his research to write this book about Black Kansas City. So, I mean.
So in a sense, an analysis of the newspapers of the day gives you a good barometer of the inclusiveness of society and the way it's being.
Absolutely. You're right. I think it does. I mean, knowing what we know now, when we go back and we read that and we read what was written about, marginalized communities, we can see, it reads and tells us that about the racism that exists because of what's excluded and what's not there. Because we know what should have been there, we know what should be said, and it's not there, and the fact that it's not tells you so much about the community of that day and what was happening at that time.
So let's get a couple more questions from students. Laura and Destiny, you guys are never shy. Come on, ask a question.
Okay, so I know that this project is based out of Kansas City.
Yes.
How would you guys feel, is your guys' goal to get this nationwide or just statewide?
Well, I wanted to be international, okay, so, and it is, so. The project has, after the project ran, I was on MSNBC, CNN, just about every news organization, a national news organization, I was on there, and NPR, I spoke on NPR, number of radio stations talking about this project. So there was national interest in what we had done. I also know that we've heard nationally, we've heard from newspapers all over the country, Philadelphia, Oklahoma, I can just go on and on, Connecticut, that are wanting to do the same thing that we did, look inward at themselves and to do the same thing in their communities. And that was, I didn't have any clue when we started this project that that would happen, but once it started happening, I was really pleased to see that other newspapers saw this as an important task for a newspaper to do, to look inward and to admit it's wrong and to make a correction and to try to transform the way they do journalism going forward. And in that sense, the project has gone nationally, and I mentioned earlier that we also, I was on the front page of the Japanese newspaper. And it's funny because when I looked at the paper, I could see my face, of course I knew it was me, but I had no idea what it was saying about me. It was saying anything, because it was all Japanese. But the project was on the front page of a Japanese newspaper, a New Zealand newspaper, so, you know, it wasn't so much the apology itself, it was how we did it, that it was much more expansive, so it has gone both nationally and internationally. That's a great thing, that makes me happy.
I'm from Kansas City, and I'm probably older than a lot of these students in here. And I remember how bad it was. And how bad downtown area was and how everything was just in general. It was run down, it was crap. And I joined the Marine Corps, I went away for 28 years, I came back. Kansas City has built itself up. And it's not as racist as it was when I was a child. It has completely changed. You think that the social, how people have been changing themselves to get out of the racist behavior that they were in has helped in you aiding in doing this project?
Yeah, I do think that that's obviously nationally, you know, this idea of what I said earlier was when after I got over my anger about what was happening on the plaza that day, what I noticed was that people of all ages and hues, and they were all in this together, and there were a number of people who were wanting to stop the racism and the profiling and the brutality. And those were not just Black folks, those were folks of all nationalities and races and gender. So yes, there's some of that, but I will also say that, you know, there's still a lot of work to be done in Kansas City and elsewhere with race. I mean, if you're keeping up with the news, I mean, just recently, we've had some horrible incidents in our school systems with, you know, students making racist comments, holding up racist signs. And so that tells you that, and these are young people, right? We're talking high school or middle school age. So that worries me more than somebody older, than older people who may spout racist things because they're young, and it's like, oh my gosh, I mean, that's coming up, that's our future, right? So we have to tackle it there as well. But yes, I do think that Kansas City was very ready overall to receive this project.
It looks like we have one or two more questions. That's fine. Destiny, go ahead.
Okay, so I know that you said that there's like diversity within like your organization, like prior to the change of it. So do you think that your proposal to it really sparked it, or do you think like people within the organization already had the prior idea of wanting to change like within the system and like to move that enforcement side? Or do you think that without your proposal, they would still like continue ignoring or like not really mentioning stuff like the circus of minors?
I think that they were aware that there was a need for it, but they were not, nobody had called them on the carpet, if you will. You know, I think the project, once they decided to do this project, they knew that if they were gonna decide to do this project and look inward, that they had to act on what they knew needed to happen, which is to create more diversity in the newsroom, create more diversity in our coverage. So it's it definitely turned the spotlight, if you will, on the Kansas City Star. We turned the spotlight on ourselves, and once we turned the spotlight on ourselves, then we could hide the light. And so, and the project was that spotlight. Everybody would be looking at us to see how we inwardly responded. And that's when, you start the hiring of more people of color at the paper. Yes, they were hiring, but we really turned the light on ourselves. And that's not an easy thing to do. It took a lot of courage for them to do that, but it also showed commitment to deciding that this is what we're going to do, and we're gonna own it. We're gonna own our failure, and we're gonna own our growth.
So one final question from Amra, did you have a question?
Oh, I was just gonna ask, before the issue was published, did you have like any doubts or fears that might have like held you back from starting the project sooner or publishing it, or did you just have the idea?
The only concerns and worries I had was we only had 6 months to do this, and I didn't think initially that that was enough time. And especially since I wasn't completely, and nobody else was really completely free to just work on the project, so that we had to also do, we did a rotation. It's really bizarre. It's like a week on the project, a week off, a week on, a week off to do this. And I was worried that we didn't have enough time to do it, and I was concerned that if we didn't spend enough time to do a good job, that we would fail again. I mean, it would be just a failure to do a project that was half done, you know what I mean? And that was my worry. I was terrified that we weren't gonna have the time to do what needed to be done to make it a good project. That was all.
I want to take the moderator's advantage and ask one last bridge building question, peace building question. And that's, you touched on it a little in your presentation, telling how people during the 77 flood who lived east of the plaza weren't able to immediately get access to federal money for improvement. But I guess I wonder, with the Star's new focus on being a real newspaper for all of the people, if you see that this creates opportunities for jobs for African Americans, for better housing for African Americans, for increased safety, and that the people who have the power and the opportunities will now open up to what had been marginalized communities so that they aren't marginalized anymore.
Yes, I think that the only way to do that is that we have to keep the spotlight on, right? We have to continue to hold people accountable, businesses accountable, education accountable, those in power, our politicians accountable. And we have to continue to call them out when they're doing a disservice, when they lack empathy, when the decisions that they are making are not beneficial to all the people, when what have been marginalized communities, when those people are not getting access to housing. We need to, as a newspaper, call our politicians out on that and talk to the people who are not getting the housing and tell their stories and show their stories, and we cannot stop. It has to be a constant hammering away. And I think that the project just made it clear to us that this is something we need to do, and we cannot forget that this is our calling, this is our purpose, and this is our responsibility. And if we continue to do that, then yeah, I think that it can bring real change outside of the newspaper, but throughout the community. And I think that that's the only way, and that's the purpose. That's why I became a journalist, like everybody else, to change the world.
Let's give Maria Rose Williams a round of applause. those who are in the audience at Park University and thank those who are virtually joining us, and also thank our sponsors, Johnson County Community College, Park University, and Steve Youngblood and everyone else who made this possible. Steve, any closing words? I guess we're done. Thank you.